According to these files, the final disposition of the estate significantly alters the previous arrangements.
Excuse me, sir. Regarding the disbursements listed here, does this account for the matured bonds?
That is a pertinent observation. However, Article 5...
The moment a maid corrected a billionaire's will, the room forgot how to breathe. The grand library of the Harrington estate was silent except for the steady ticking of an antique clock mounted above the fireplace. Sunlight filtered through towering windows nearly 12 feet tall, casting long golden reflections across polished hardwood floors. Family portraits watched from the walls, generations of wealth frozen inside expensive frames. At the center of the room sat the Harrington family, gathered around a massive mahogany table worth more than most people's homes. They had come for one reason. William Harrington was gone, and his fortune was about to be divided. Attorney James Walker adjusted his glasses and opened the thick leather folder resting before him. Every movement seemed deliberate. Every page carried weight. Across the table, William's son Ethan Harrington sat with his arms folded, trying to appear calm despite the tension visible in his jaw. His sister Victoria sat beside him, fingers resting lightly on a crystal glass of water. Other relatives filled the remaining chairs, each hiding their expectations behind carefully controlled expressions. Some hoped for larger shares. Others feared disappointment. All of them listened as the attorney began reading. Standing quietly near the back wall was Naomi Carter. For nearly 12 years, she had worked inside this house. She knew which floorboards creaked in winter. She knew which paintings William liked most. She knew exactly how he preferred his morning coffee. Yet despite more than a decade inside the mansion, she remained almost invisible to many members of the family. Today was no different. No one had asked her opinion. No one expected her to speak. She was simply there to assist if needed. As Attorney Walker continued reading, the room remained focused on every word. Millions of dollars moved across pages through legal language that sounded cold compared to the emotions hidden beneath it. Ethan occasionally exchanged glances with Victoria. A few relatives shifted nervously in their chairs. Naomi listened quietly while organizing refreshments on a side table. Then something happened. One sentence entered the room and immediately caught her attention. It was not dramatic. It was not spoken loudly. Yet the moment she heard it, Naomi stopped moving. Her hand froze beside a silver serving tray. Slowly, her eyes lifted toward the attorney. Attorney Walker continued reading without noticing. The family remained focused on inheritance percentages and asset distributions. But Naomi felt a strange sensation settle in her chest. A memory, a conversation, a detail she had not thought about in months. Her eyes moved toward the portrait of William Harrington hanging above the fireplace. The elderly billionaire stared back from the painting with the same thoughtful expression she remembered from real life. Naomi swallowed quietly. Something was wrong. She could not explain it yet. She only knew that a single line in the document did not fit the man she had known. The attorney turned another page. The reading continued. No one else seemed concerned. No one else appeared to notice anything unusual. Yet Naomi found herself listening more carefully with each passing second. The ticking clock suddenly sounded louder. The room seemed smaller. Her heartbeat quickened. She told herself there was probably a simple explanation. After all, she was not a lawyer. She was not part of the family. She was certainly not someone expected to question a billionaire's final wishes. And yet the feeling refused to leave. Across the room, sunlight shifted slightly across the table as the attorney approached another important section of the will. Ethan leaned forward. Victoria straightened in her chair. Every relative focused on the next words about to be spoken. Meanwhile, standing quietly near the wall, Naomi Carter continued staring at the document with growing concern, unaware that the next few hours would change how everyone in that room saw her forever. The attorney's voice continued across the library, steady and professional, but Naomi Carter barely heard the next few sentences. Her attention remained fixed on the strange feeling that had settled in her mind. Something about the document did not match the man she had known for more than a decade. The realization lingered, like a distant echo she could not ignore. Around the massive table, members of the Harrington family remained focused on the inheritance. Some listened carefully. Others silently calculated what each section might mean for their future. Expensive watches glimmered beneath the afternoon sunlight. Crystal glasses sat untouched beside leather-bound notebooks. Wealth filled every corner of the room. Yet Naomi knew something many of them did not. Wealth had never been the thing William Harrington valued most. For 12 years, she had watched him move through life in ways his family rarely saw. Most people knew the billionaire. Naomi had known the man. She remembered the mornings when he would sit alone in the sunroom reading letters from former employees. She remembered how he always stopped to learn the names of maintenance workers. She remembered the winter evening when a delivery driver became stranded during a snowstorm and William personally insisted the young man stay for dinner rather than drive home in dangerous conditions. Those moments never appeared in business magazines. They never appeared in interviews. Yet they revealed who he truly was. Naomi had arrived at the Harrington estate 12 years earlier with little more than determination and a recommendation letter. The mansion had seemed overwhelming then. Nearly 20,000 square feet of polished stone, grand staircases, towering windows, and endless hallways. She had expected to remain only a year or two. Instead, she became one of the most trusted employees on the property. Not because she sought attention. Quite the opposite. Naomi possessed a rare ability to make herself useful without becoming the center of any situation. She noticed details others overlooked. She remembered schedules. She anticipated needs before people expressed them. Most family members appreciated her work, but rarely looked beyond it. To them, she was part of the household staff. Reliable, efficient, forgettable. William had been different. Over the years, he occasionally asked her opinion about books he was reading. Sometimes he discussed local community projects. Once, during a late evening conversation in the library, he spent nearly an hour speaking about responsibility. Not the responsibility of employees. The responsibility of people with power. Naomi remembered that conversation clearly because it had surprised her. Billionaires were often portrayed as obsessed with money. William had spoken far more about legacy than wealth. The memory returned now as Attorney Walker turned another page. Naomi glanced toward William's portrait once again. The expression in the painting seemed almost thoughtful, as though the old billionaire still had something left to say. Ethan Harrington shifted forward in his chair. Victoria quietly reviewed notes on a tablet. Neither seemed aware of Naomi's growing concern. Why would they be? She was standing against the wall like she had on countless other occasions. Invisible, observing, listening. Yet deep inside, a question continued growing stronger. The section being read felt wrong. Not legally wrong. Personally wrong. It contradicted something William had once said with complete certainty. Naomi could still hear his voice from months earlier. She could still remember the exact room where the conversation happened. The exact chair where he had been sitting. The exact look on his face. The more she remembered, the harder it became to ignore. She looked toward the document again. Her heartbeat quickened slightly. Somewhere within those pages existed a detail that did not belong. And for the first time since entering the library, Naomi began to wonder whether remaining silent would be the greater mistake. Attorney James Walker paused briefly to take a sip of water before continuing the reading. The quiet rustle of paper echoed through the library. Outside the tall windows, the late afternoon sun had begun its slow descent, bathing the estate grounds in warm amber light. Inside, however, the atmosphere revolved entirely around one thing. Money. Generations of wealth sat hidden within the pages resting on the attorney's desk. Every person around the mahogany table seemed to understand that their future might change before the day was over. Ethan Harrington appeared calm on the surface, but Naomi Carter noticed the small signs of tension. His fingers tapped lightly against the arm of his chair whenever a new asset was mentioned. Victoria Harrington maintained a composed expression, yet she repeatedly glanced toward the attorney whenever percentages or trusts were discussed. Other relatives listened just as carefully. Some tried to appear indifferent. Others leaned forward whenever certain properties or investments were mentioned. Naomi had witnessed family gatherings before, but this felt different. William Harrington's absence filled the room like a silent presence. The billionaire had spent decades building an empire. Now the people he left behind sat waiting to discover what part of that empire would belong to them. The attorney continued reading. Names, accounts, charitable foundations, business holdings, and personal instructions flowed from one page to another. No one interrupted. No one wanted to miss a word. Naomi remained near the wall, hands folded neatly in front of her. From that position, she could see everyone. More importantly, She could remember things others could not. During her years in the mansion, she had observed countless conversations between William and members of his family. Some were warm, some were difficult, yet one pattern remained constant. William always spoke carefully when discussing legacy. He often said money could create comfort, but character created meaning. Those words had stayed with Naomi because he repeated them often. The memory surfaced again as Attorney Walker reached another section of the document. Naomi felt the same uneasy sensation return. She could not explain why. She only knew that the wording being read seemed strangely disconnected from the man she remembered. Her eyes drifted once more toward William's portrait above the fireplace. She remembered a particular evening less than a year earlier. Rain had tapped gently against the library windows while William sat in his favorite leather chair reviewing documents. Naomi had entered to bring tea. Before she left, he had unexpectedly asked her a question. "Do you know why most families fight over inheritance?" he had said. Naomi had smiled politely and admitted she did not. William had looked toward the rain outside. Because they focus on what they are receiving instead of what they are responsible for preserving. At the time, the statement seemed philosophical. Now, standing in the same library months later, it felt important. Very important. Around the table, nobody appeared interested in philosophy. Their attention remained fixed on numbers and ownership. Ethan exchanged a glance with one of his cousins. Victoria reviewed another note on her tablet. The attorney turned yet another page. Then Naomi heard a familiar phrase. Her eyes widened almost imperceptibly. The wording connected directly to a conversation she remembered with startling clarity. Not a vague memory, not an impression, a specific conversation, a specific date, a specific instruction. Her heartbeat quickened. The uneasy feeling that had followed her since the reading began suddenly became much stronger. She did not yet know what the explanation was. She only knew one thing with certainty. Somewhere inside the document being read aloud, a detail existed that William Harrington himself would have immediately questioned. The words continued flowing from Attorney James Walker's lips, but Naomi Carter was no longer listening to the will in the same way as everyone else in the room. She was listening to her memory. The library around her seemed to fade into the background. The mahogany table, the crystal glasses, the expensive artwork, and even the anxious relatives became distant as a single moment from the previous year returned with remarkable clarity. It had happened on a quiet autumn evening. Most of the household staff had already left for the day. Rain tapped softly against the windows of the mansion while William Harrington sat alone in the library reviewing documents. Naomi had entered carrying a tray with tea. She remembered the scent of old books. She remembered the warm glow of the fireplace. Most of all, she remembered the conversation that followed. William had been studying several legal papers spread across his desk. At one point, he looked up and smiled. "Sometimes people think a signature is the most important part of a document," he had said. Naomi remembered laughing. Politely, William shook his head. "It is usually the date that changes everything." The statement seemed strange at the time. He had then tapped one particular page and explained how a simple error in timing could completely alter the meaning of an important decision. Naomi had not fully understood why he seemed so concerned about it. She only remembered how serious he became while discussing the subject. Standing in the library now, she felt a chill move through her chest. The phrase she had just heard during the reading connected directly to that conversation. More importantly, a specific date mentioned in the will seemed impossible. Naomi carefully replayed the timeline in her mind. She remembered where William had been during that period. She remembered who had visited the estate. She remembered several conversations that occurred around the same time. The more she thought about it, the more convinced she became that something did not fit. Around the table, the family remained completely focused on the inheritance. Ethan Harrington leaned forward as another section was read. Victoria quietly reviewed notes on her tablet. A cousin smiled faintly after hearing details about a property transfer. Nobody appeared interested in questioning anything. Why would they? A respected attorney was reading a legally prepared document. Yet Naomi could not silence the growing concern inside her. Attorney Walker turned another page. The sound seemed unusually loud. Naomi glanced toward William's portrait again. The old billionaire had trusted details. He had trusted accuracy. He had often said that important decisions deserved careful attention because small mistakes could become large problems. The memory felt almost like a warning. Naomi lowered her eyes briefly. She understood the position she occupied in the room. She was a maid. Everyone else belonged to the family, the legal team, or the business circle surrounding William's estate. Speaking up would draw attention she had never wanted. Worse, it could appear disrespectful. Her hands tightened slightly around the edge of the serving tray. Part of her wanted to remain silent and allow the reading to continue. Another part refused to ignore what she remembered. As Attorney Walker prepared to begin the next section, Naomi slowly lifted her head. The uneasy feeling had become certainty. She still did not know exactly what the explanation was, but she knew one thing beyond doubt. Before this meeting ended, she would have to find the courage to say something. Attorney James Walker cleared his throat and prepared to continue reading. The family leaned forward once again. The atmosphere in the library had become increasingly tense as the details of William Harrington's estate unfolded page by page. Naomi Carter stood near the wall, her thoughts racing beneath an outward appearance of calm. The certainty she felt now was impossible to ignore. She knew she should remain silent. She also knew she probably could not. The conflict pulled at her from both directions. One voice reminded her of her place in the room. The other reminded her of William. She looked toward the portrait above the fireplace. The late billionaire seemed almost present in the golden afternoon light. Naomi remembered his words about responsibility. She remembered how seriously he treated accuracy. Most of all, she remembered his belief that doing the right thing was often uncomfortable. The attorney began reading another section. Ethan Harrington listened carefully. Victoria reviewed a figure written on her tablet. Several relatives exchanged satisfied glances as valuable properties and investments were assigned. Naomi felt her pulse quicken. The date she remembered remained fixed in her mind. The more she examined it, the less sense the document made. Finally, before she could lose her nerve, she took a small step forward. The movement was subtle, yet it immediately felt enormous to her. No one noticed at first. Attorney Walker continued reading. Naomi opened her mouth, then hesitated. Her hands tightened slightly. 12 years of working quietly in the background had taught her not to interrupt important people. Yet another memory surfaced. William sitting beside the library fireplace. William insisting that details mattered. William explaining that silence could sometimes allow mistakes to grow larger. Naomi took a breath. "Excuse me." The words were soft but clear. The room froze almost instantly. Attorney Walker stopped reading. Several heads turned toward the back of the room. Ethan looked confused. Victoria lowered her tablet. For a moment, nobody seemed to understand what had happened. Naomi almost wished she could disappear. Every eye in the library was now focused on her. "I apologize for interrupting," she said politely, "but I believe there may be something that should be reviewed." Silence followed. Then one of the cousins gave a short laugh. Another relative smiled in disbelief. Ethan frowned. "Reviewed?" he asked. Naomi nodded carefully. "There is a detail I remember that may be important." A few family members exchanged amused glances. The reaction was immediate and unmistakable. They were not angry. They simply could not imagine why a maid would have anything meaningful to contribute to a legal discussion about a billionaire's estate. One relative leaned back in his chair and chuckled quietly. "This should be interesting." Another shook her head. Victoria sighed softly. Ethan looked toward the attorney. "Are we seriously stopping the reading for this?" The laughter spread lightly around portions of the table. Not cruel laughter. Dismissive laughter. The kind reserved for people who are not expected to know better. Naomi felt heat rise in her face, but remained composed. She did not argue. She did not defend herself. She simply stood quietly, waiting for permission to explain. Across the room, the portrait of William Harrington seemed to watch over the gathering. And for the first time since the meeting began, Attorney James Walker closed the folder in front of him and looked directly at Naomi with genuine curiosity. Attorney James Walker studied Naomi Carter for several seconds before speaking. The laughter that had drifted around the table gradually faded. Curiosity replaced amusement. The attorney had spent decades handling complicated estates, and experience had taught him that important information sometimes arrived from unexpected places. He folded his hands carefully on top of the document. "What detail are you referring to, Miss Carter?" he asked. Naomi felt every eye in the room settle on her. The attention was uncomfortable. She had spent most of her adult life avoiding the spotlight, not standing in the center of it. Yet now there was no turning back. She took a slow breath. I may be mistaken, she said politely. That is entirely possible. But I remember Mr. Harrington speaking very specifically about one section of his estate less than a year ago. Ethan Harrington leaned back in his chair and sighed. This is exactly why legal matters should be left to lawyers. A few relatives nodded in agreement. Naomi did not react. She kept her focus on the attorney. I only wanted to mention something that seemed inconsistent. Attorney Walker remained calm. Go on. The room grew quiet once again. Naomi glanced briefly toward William's portrait. The memory that had troubled her all afternoon returned with complete clarity. Mr. Harrington once explained that a particular decision could not be finalized before a certain date, she said. He was very clear about it. Ethan frowned. And you remember this from a casual conversation? Naomi nodded. I remember because he spent nearly 20 minutes explaining why timing mattered. Victoria lowered her tablet. Her expression had changed slightly. The confidence she displayed earlier now carried a trace of uncertainty. Naomi continued carefully. The date mentioned during the reading does not seem to match what he told me. Another relative laughed softly. You are challenging a legal document because of a conversation? Naomi immediately shook her head. No, I am not challenging anything. I am simply asking whether it might be worth checking. Her calm response removed any hint of confrontation. She was not accusing anyone. She was not claiming expertise. She was only raising a question. The distinction mattered. Attorney Walker studied her face. Then he looked down at the open pages before him. His eyes moved across several paragraphs. The silence deepened. Even Ethan stopped speaking. Outside the tall windows, the sun had begun slipping lower behind the trees surrounding the estate. Golden light stretched across the hardwood floor. Dust particles floated lazily through the air. The library felt strangely still. Naomi waited quietly. She had said everything she intended to say. If the attorney dismissed her concern, she would accept it. Yet something in his expression suggested he was taking her seriously. Finally, Attorney Walker adjusted his glasses and reread a section more carefully. Then he turned back several pages. Another page followed. His movements became slower, more deliberate. The room noticed immediately. Ethan sat forward. Victoria looked toward the document. One by one, family members exchanged uncertain glances. The attorney stopped on a specific page and frowned. It was a small reaction, barely visible. Yet Naomi noticed it instantly. So did everyone else. For the first time since the reading began, the confidence inside the room seemed to crack. Attorney Walker remained silent for several moments. Then he reached for a second folder resting beside the original documents. And when his hand settled on the unopened file, an uneasy feeling spread through the library that no one could explain. Attorney James Walker slowly opened the second folder resting beside the original will. The movement seemed insignificant, yet every person in the library watched as though the future depended on what lay inside. The uneasy silence deepened. Ethan Harrington shifted forward in his chair. Victoria lowered her tablet completely. Several relatives exchanged uncertain glances. Naomi Carter remained standing near the wall, saying nothing. Her role in the room had already changed. Only minutes earlier, she had been almost invisible. Now everyone was waiting to discover whether her concern meant anything at all. Attorney Walker carefully removed several documents and placed them beside the original file. His eyes moved back and forth between the pages. Once, twice, then a third time. The attorney's expression grew noticeably more serious. Ethan finally broke the silence. What exactly are you looking at? Attorney Walker did not answer immediately. Instead, he adjusted his glasses and continued reading. The library clock ticked steadily above the fireplace. Outside, the last rays of afternoon sunlight stretched across the estate grounds. Inside, the atmosphere felt increasingly fragile. Finally, Attorney Walker spoke. There appears to be a discrepancy. The words landed like a stone in still water. No one moved. Ethan stared at him. A discrepancy? The attorney nodded slowly. The date referenced in the primary document does not align with the supporting records. Victoria immediately sat upright. What does that mean? Attorney Walker looked down again. At the moment, it means I need to verify something. He turned another page. Then another. Naomi watched quietly. The memory she carried had guided her this far, but she still did not know where it would lead. She only knew William Harrington had been extremely careful about details. The possibility of an inconsistency seemed impossible to ignore. Attorney Walker suddenly stopped turning pages, his eyes fixed on a single paragraph. The room became perfectly still. Ethan noticed the change immediately. "What is it?" This time the attorney answered. "I found the issue." Several relatives exchanged alarmed looks. Victoria leaned closer. Attorney Walker placed the original will beside another document from the secondary folder. The date in the final version references an instruction that had not yet been legally approved at that time. The room fell silent. Ethan frowned. That cannot be right. Attorney Walker pointed carefully to the documents. According to these records, the approval occurred several weeks later. The realization slowly spread across the room. What Naomi had questioned was not merely a memory. It was connected to an actual inconsistency inside the estate documents. No one laughed now. No one smiled. The dismissive confidence from earlier had vanished completely. Ethan looked toward Naomi for the first time with genuine uncertainty. Victoria stared at the papers in disbelief. Attorney Walker continued reviewing the file. Then his hand stopped on a sealed envelope attached to the supporting records. The envelope appeared old, but carefully preserved. A handwritten note rested across the front. The attorney's eyes widened slightly. "I do not believe this." The room held its breath. "What is it?" Victoria asked. Attorney Walker slowly lifted the envelope. The handwriting was unmistakable. Every member of the family recognized it immediately. William Harrington himself had written it. Beneath his signature appeared a simple instruction: to be reviewed if questions arise regarding final estate directives. No one spoke. Even the clock seemed quieter. Naomi stared at the envelope from across the room. Ethan looked as though he had forgotten how to blink. The attorney carefully turned the envelope over in his hands. Then, with every eye in the library fixed upon him, he prepared to break the seal left behind by William Harrington himself. Attorney James Walker carefully broke the seal on the envelope while every person in the library watched in complete silence. The simple sound of paper opening seemed unusually loud inside the enormous room. Nobody spoke. Nobody shifted in their chair. Even the relatives who had laughed at Naomi Carter earlier now sat motionless. The envelope had transformed everything. Moments ago, the discussion centered on percentages, assets, and ownership. Now it centered on something far more important: William Harrington's final words. The attorney slowly unfolded several pages written entirely in William's handwriting. He studied the first page, then paused. His expression changed immediately. Ethan Harrington noticed it first. "What does it say?" Attorney Walker took a breath before answering. "It appears your father anticipated the possibility of confusion regarding the final estate documents." The room remained frozen. Victoria leaned forward. "Read it." Attorney Walker nodded and began. William's words filled the library once more. Unlike the legal language of the will, the letter sounded personal, human, direct. He explained that several revisions had been discussed during his final year. He explained that timing mattered. He explained that any document referencing decisions before certain approvals should be carefully reviewed because some instructions had changed during the process. As the attorney continued reading, Naomi felt her heartbeat quicken. The memory she had trusted was unfolding line by line inside the letter. William specifically mentioned a conversation with his legal team regarding the exact category of assets that had triggered her concern. Then came the sentence that changed the room. Attorney Walker stopped briefly before reading it aloud. "If there is ever uncertainty regarding the date associated with these directives, the supporting records should take precedence because they reflect my final intentions." Silence followed. Absolute silence. Ethan stared at the documents. Victoria lowered her eyes toward the table. Several relatives looked completely stunned. The discrepancy Naomi had questioned was no longer a possibility. William himself had addressed it. The attorney carefully compared the handwritten letter against the supporting records. Every piece aligned. The approval dates. The sequence of revisions. The timeline William had described. Everything pointed toward the same conclusion. The version initially being read contained a timing inconsistency that required correction based on William's documented instructions. Nobody laughed now. Nobody questioned why Naomi had spoken. Attorney Walker removed his glasses and looked toward her. "Ms. Carter," he said quietly, "your observation was correct." The words settled over the room like a wave. Naomi immediately lowered her eyes. She had not spoken because she wanted recognition. She had spoken because remaining silent felt wrong. Ethan slowly turned toward her. Earlier, he had dismissed her concern without hesitation. Now he seemed unable to find words. Victoria appeared equally shaken. For years they had viewed Naomi as part of the household background. Reliable, respectful, invisible. Yet the person who had protected their father's true intentions was not sitting at the table. She had been standing quietly near the wall. Attorney Walker continued reviewing the documents before speaking again. Had this issue gone unnoticed today, your father's final instructions might not have been interpreted correctly. Another silence followed, longer this time. He carefully placed William's letter beside the will. The late afternoon sunlight had faded, leaving the library bathed in softer evening light. Shadows stretched across the hardwood floor. Nobody seemed interested in inheritance anymore. Their attention remained fixed on Naomi Carter. The woman they had overlooked for 12 years had preserved the one thing William Harrington valued most. Not his fortune, his intentions. And for the first time since the meeting began, every person in the room saw her differently. No one spoke for several seconds after Attorney James Walker finished explaining the significance of William Harrington's letter. The silence felt different now. Earlier it had been filled with doubt and tension. Now it carried reflection. Evening shadows stretched across the library as the final traces of sunlight faded beyond the tall windows. The room that had once been focused entirely on inheritance seemed transformed. Attorney Walker carefully organized the corrected documents and placed William's handwritten letter beside them. The billionaire's final intentions had been preserved, not because of a legal team, not because of a family member, because one woman had trusted her memory and her conscience. Naomi Carter remained standing near the wall exactly where she had stood when the meeting began. She had not moved toward the table. She had not sought recognition. She had not attempted to prove herself superior to anyone. She simply listened quietly while the room absorbed what had happened. Ethan Harrington slowly rose from his chair. For a moment, he appeared unsure of what to say. The confidence that had defined him earlier in the afternoon was gone. He looked toward Naomi and shook his head slightly. "I owe you an apology," he said. The words sounded genuine. "When you spoke up, I assumed you were mistaken." Naomi offered a small smile. "You had every reason to trust the documents." Ethan looked down briefly before meeting her eyes again. "No, I had every reason to listen before making assumptions." Across the table, Victoria nodded quietly. Several relatives who had laughed earlier now avoided looking directly at Naomi. The memory of their reactions seemed to weigh heavily on them. Attorney Walker closed the final folder and stood. William Harrington often said that wisdom and character could be found in unexpected places, he said. Today I believe he would be pleased that someone cared enough to protect his wishes. Naomi felt emotion rise unexpectedly in her chest. Of all the things she could have received that evening, those words meant the most. Money had never belonged to her story. Respect did. Understanding did. Being seen did. The meeting slowly came to an end. Relatives gathered their belongings. Conversations remained subdued. Nobody rushed toward discussions about assets or percentages. The events of the afternoon had shifted something deeper than financial expectations. One by one, family members left the library. Several paused to thank Naomi before departing. Others simply offered quiet nods of respect. Eventually, only Naomi remained near the fireplace. The room had grown peaceful again. She looked toward William Harrington's portrait hanging above the mantel. The familiar expression seemed unchanged, yet somehow the room felt lighter. Her eyes drifted to the handwritten letter resting on the table. William's final wishes would be honored exactly as he intended. That was enough. Naomi picked up the serving tray she had carried all afternoon and began walking toward the doorway. Behind her, the antique clock continued its steady rhythm. Outside, evening lights appeared across the estate grounds. She stepped into the hallway and moved forward with the same quiet dignity she had always possessed. Nothing about her had changed. She was still the same woman who arrived each morning ready to work. The difference was that others finally saw what had been there all along. And as the library door closed softly behind her, the silence left in the room felt less like emptiness and more like the quiet sound of justice finally finding its place.
Thank you again for your help this morning, sweetie.
Of course. You have a lovely day now.